Okay guys, just before we finish up, I'm going to show you how to fix leak errors in your map. So how do you know you have a leak error? You hit F9 to compile, and you get this error here. Leaked entity trigger multiple. So something is getting out into the void, and this is actually giving us the XYZ coordinates, so we could type those into our view and find it that way, but there's an easier way. So there's two major common causes of leaks. The first one is you have a gap in your geometry somewhere. So if we turned off func detail, there is a gap somewhere in the map between these walls. Now this gap could only be a centimeter thick, so it would take forever to actually find this. Instead of doing that, we can just go up to map and go load point file, hit OK. And you can see what's that done if we zoom out. It's created a red line. What that red line is doing is showing us where the leak is. So you can see that this entity is leaking through this crack. And you can see, whoops, yep, at some point I've somehow missed this and created a small gap in my map. So if we close that up, we'll now be able to compile correctly. Now I'll show you the second type of leak. So we hit F9 and we get entity trigger multiple leaked. Map, load point file, OK. And again, we search through our map, we can see we've got a, we've accidentally somehow copied a trigger outside the map zone. And that's what's leaking because we've got an entity in the void. So we just bring that back in and that will be fixed. Now, there is actually a third type of leak, which is much more rare, but way harder to find. So you'll notice that this trigger entity here has this little dot in the middle. So that dot is essentially the pivot point of the entity. Now if we move that dot outside the map, we can see that the entity is in the map, the dot is outside the map. Guess what? When we compile, we get a leak. And if we go map, load point file, OK, you'll see that that red line is pointing to the dot. So the dot is kind of how the engine says that is the center. So even though it looks like everything's okay, we actually have the center of the entity outside. So we'll have to drag that back in. And when we hit F9, our map compiles. It's going to cancel that. So those are the three most common errors for map compiling. Other errors could be that you have translucent materials on these walls. So for instance, if I had a glass material that is see-through to the void and I tried compiling, we're also going to get an error. And again, we can go map, load point file, yep, and just goes whoops, shows us here that this is see-through and thus we're exposed to the void. So we just cover that up and great. So we've fixed all our leak errors. We can turn back on our world detail and our map will compile correctly. And that goes for all entities, by the way, not just trigger teleports, but in some cases, other entities like a player spawn and whatnot will cause maps. So just make sure everything, absolutely everything is encased and you have no leaks in your map. Load point file solves most of those problems for you. It'll give you this big red line that you can find and view in 3D space. So that's great. All right, guys, let's move on to publishing.